The radio crackled with static as Captain Maria Rodriguez gripped the controls of her massive C-130 Hercules transport aircraft. Below her, through sheets of torrential rain, she could barely make out the flooded airstrip where 8 Navy SEALs were trapped behind enemy lines. The runway was completely submerged under 3 feet of muddy water, making a landing seemingly impossible. Every pilot in the squadron had refused the mission, calling it suicide. Negative on the landing, Phoenix 1, came the voice from command. Abort mission. Runway conditions are too dangerous. But Maria could hear something else through her headset, the desperate voices of the stranded SEALs as enemy forces closed in on their position. They had been compromised during a classified operation in hostile territory, and she was their only way out. The weather was worsening by the minute, and soon even her aircraft wouldn't be able to reach them. As she circled the flooded airbase one more time, Maria made a decision that would either save 8 lives or cost 9. She was about to attempt something that had never been done before, landing a 75-ton aircraft on a runway that existed only underwater. The laws of physics said it was impossible. Her training manual said it was forbidden. But sometimes, when lives hang in the balance, impossible becomes the only option. This is the true story of how one pilot's courage and skill turned an impossible rescue into a legendary moment in military aviation history. A story that would be whispered about in pilot-ready rooms for decades to come. The morning sun cast long shadows across the flight line at Forward Operating Base Kandahar as Captain Maria Rodriguez completed her pre-flight inspection of the massive C-130 Hercules. At 28 years old, she had already earned a reputation as one of the most skilled transport pilots in the Air Force. But nothing in her training had prepared her for the mission that awaited her that day. Maria ran her hands along the aircraft's battle-scarred fuselage, checking for any signs of damage from their previous mission. The Hercules had served faithfully through countless operations, delivering supplies and personnel to some of the most dangerous locations on Earth. Its 4 turboprop engines could push the massive aircraft through weather that would ground smaller planes, and its rugged construction allowed it to land on improvised airstrips that would destroy conventional aircraft. The briefing room was unusually quiet when Maria entered at 0600 hours. Colonel James Mitchell, the squadron commander, stood at the front of the room with a grim expression on his weathered face. Behind him, a large map displayed the mountainous region of eastern Afghanistan, with several red zones marking areas of heavy enemy activity. "Ladies and gentlemen," Colonel Mitchell began, his voice carrying the weight of years of combat experience. "We have a situation developing in the Hindu Kush Mountains. 8 Navy SEALs from SEAL Team 6 have been conducting a classified operation in the region for the past 72 hours. Their mission was to gather intelligence on a high-value target believed to be coordinating attacks against coalition forces." Maria leaned forward in her seat, studying the map intently. The target area was deep in hostile territory, surrounded by Taliban strongholds and treacherous mountain terrain. It was the kind of place where helicopters struggled to operate due to the thin air and unpredictable weather patterns. At approximately 0300 hours this morning, the colonel continued, the SEAL team's position was compromised during their extraction phase. They engaged enemy forces and successfully eliminated the immediate threat, but their helicopter extraction was forced to abort due to intense ground fire. The team is now stranded at a remote airbase that was abandoned by Soviet forces decades ago. The room fell silent as the implications became clear. Without immediate extraction, the SEALs would be overwhelmed by reinforcing enemy units. The nearest coalition forces were hundreds of miles away, and conventional rescue operations would take too long to organize. "The weather in the target area has deteriorated significantly," Colonel Mitchell explained, clicking to the next slide. "A major storm system has moved through the region, bringing heavy rain and flooding. The abandoned airstrip where the SEALs are located has been completely submerged under several feet of water." Maria studied the satellite images showing the flooded runway. The ancient concrete strip was barely visible beneath the murky water that had pooled in the valley. Debris and mud had been swept across the landing area, creating an obstacle course of hidden dangers. "Sir," spoke up Major Thompson, one of the more experienced pilots in the squadron, "landing on a flooded runway of that length would be extremely dangerous, if not impossible. The C-130 needs firm ground contact for braking and steering. Water would eliminate all friction and control." Colonel Mitchell nodded grimly. "That's exactly what our flight operations team has concluded. Every scenario analysis shows unacceptable risk levels. However, The SEALs' situation is becoming more critical by the hour. Enemy forces are converging on their position from multiple directions. Maria raised her hand. What about helicopter extraction once the weather clears? Negative, the colonel replied. The storm system is expected to persist for at least another 18 hours. By then, the enemy will have overwhelming numbers in the area. The SEALs have enough ammunition and defensive positions to hold out for perhaps 6 to 8 hours at most. The mathematical reality was harsh and unforgiving. 8 elite warriors, among the most highly trained soldiers in the world, were trapped with no viable extraction option. Their families didn't even know they were in danger. The classified nature of their mission meant that notification would only come after the operation's completion, whether successful or tragic. There is one possibility, Colonel Mitchell said, his voice dropping to a more serious tone. The abandoned airbase has a longer runway than our initial reports indicated. Soviet engineering was robust, and the concrete foundation appears to be intact beneath the floodwater. If a pilot could successfully land and take off from the submerged runway, extraction would be possible. Major Thompson shook his head. Sir, with all due respect, that's suicide. The water depth alone would make it impossible to maintain directional control. Add in the debris, mud, and reduced visibility, and you're looking at a certain crash. But Maria was already running calculations in her mind. She had studied unconventional landing techniques during her advanced training, including emergency procedures for landing on damaged or compromised runways. The C-130's design included several features that might make such an operation theoretically possible, though it had never been attempted under these specific conditions. The aircraft's high-mounted engines would keep the propellers and air intakes above the water level during ground operations. The rugged landing gear was designed to handle rough terrain and could potentially provide enough clearance to prevent the fuselage from contacting the water. Most importantly, the C-130's powerful engines could generate enough thrust to maintain some control even without normal braking friction. What's the current status of the SEAL team? Maria asked. They're dug in at the old control tower and adjacent buildings, Colonel Mitchell replied. The structures are concrete and provide good defensive positions, but they won't hold against sustained assault. The team leader, Senior Chief Petty Officer Marcus Kane, is a 20-year veteran with multiple combat deployments. If anyone can buy us time, it's him and his team. The weight of responsibility settled on everyone in the room. 8 lives hung in the balance, and the window for action was rapidly closing. Maria thought about the families who would receive notification if the mission failed, wives who would become widows, children who would grow up without fathers, parents who would lose their sons. I volunteer for the mission, Maria said quietly, her voice cutting through the heavy silence. Colonel Mitchell looked at her with a mixture of surprise and concern. Captain Rodriguez, I appreciate your courage, but I cannot in good conscience authorize a mission with such low probability of success. The risk assessment clearly indicates, sir, with respect, Maria interrupted. Risk assessments are based on standard operating procedures and normal conditions. This situation is anything but normal. Sometimes you have to go beyond the textbook to save lives. She stood and walked to the map, pointing to the target area. The C-130 has capabilities that other aircraft don't. Our approach angle can be adjusted to account for the water depth. If I come in steep and use maximum reverse thrust immediately upon touchdown, I might be able to maintain enough control to stop safely. And what about takeoff? Major Thompson asked. Even if you somehow manage to land safely, getting airborne again from a flooded runway with 8 additional passengers would be even more dangerous. Maria had been thinking about that exact problem. The storm system is moving east. By the time I could complete the landing and passenger loading, wind conditions might actually be favorable for takeoff. A strong headwind would reduce the ground roll required and help compensate for the reduced friction. The room erupted in murmured discussions as pilots debated the feasibility of Maria's proposal. Some argued that it was impossible and reckless, while others began to see potential solutions to the technical challenges involved. Colonel Mitchell raised his hand for silence. Captain Rodriguez, I need you to understand the full implications of what you're proposing. This mission has never been attempted before. There are no procedures, no training protocols, and no backup plans. If something goes wrong, you'll be on your own with no possibility of rescue. Maria met his gaze steadily. Sir, that's exactly the situation the SEALs are facing right now. They went into harm's way to protect our people. Now it's our turn to do the same for them. The colonel studied her face, seeing the determination and resolve that had made her one of his most trusted pilots. He knew that Maria wasn't being reckless or seeking glory. She had simply calculated the odds and decided that 8 lives were worth the risk of one. "Very well," he said finally. "But we do this by the book as much as possible. I want full weather updates every 15 minutes, constant communication with the SEAL team, and abort criteria clearly established. If conditions deteriorate beyond acceptable limits, you turn around immediately." Maria nodded. "Understood, sir." As the briefing concluded and pilots began filing out of the room, Maria remained behind to study the tactical maps more carefully. She traced the flight path from Kandahar to the target area, noting the mountain peaks, weather patterns, and potential hazards along the route. The abandoned airbase was located in a narrow valley surrounded by peaks that rose to over 12,000 feet. The approach would require precise navigation through difficult terrain, made even more challenging by the storm conditions. But Maria had flown similar routes before, and she was confident in her ability to reach the target area safely. The real challenge would begin once she arrived at the flooded airstrip. She would have only one chance to get the landing right. Too fast, and she would overshoot the runway and crash into the mountains beyond. Too slow, and she would sink into the flood water and be trapped. The margin for error was essentially zero. As Maria walked toward her aircraft to begin final preparations, she thought about the 8 SEALs who were depending on her. She didn't know their names or their stories, but she knew they were elite warriors who had volunteered for one of the most dangerous missions imaginable. They had families waiting for them at home, dreams, and plans for the future that would be cut short if she failed. The weight of that responsibility was both crushing and inspiring. It reminded her why she had joined the military in the first place, not for personal glory or career advancement, but to serve something greater than herself. Today, that service would be measured in the most fundamental way possible, the preservation of human life. Maria climbed into the cockpit of her C-130 and began the complex startup procedures that would soon take her into the most dangerous mission of her career. Outside, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, a visual reminder of the challenges that lay ahead. But she was ready. Her training, experience, and determination had prepared her for this moment. The engines roared to life, their powerful turboprops churning the air as the massive aircraft prepared for takeoff. In a few hours, Maria would attempt something that had never been done before. The outcome would either be remembered as one of the greatest rescue missions in military history, or as a tragic reminder of the limits of human capability. Either way, 8 Navy SEALs would know that someone had been willing to risk everything to bring them home. Senior Chief Petty Officer Marcus Kane pressed his back against the cold concrete wall of the abandoned Soviet control tower and checked his watch. 0800 hours. They had been holding this position for 5 hours now, and the enemy was getting bolder with each passing minute. Through the broken windows, he could see movement in the tree line approximately 400 meters to the south. The Taliban fighters were probing their defenses, looking for weaknesses. "Chief, I count at least 30 hostiles moving through Sector 7, whispered Petty Officer First Class Jake Morrison, adjusting his scope for a better view. Morrison was the team's designated marksman, and his Barrett M82 sniper rifle had already accounted for 6 enemy casualties since the firefight began. "They're trying to flank us through the old maintenance buildings." Kane keyed his radio with practiced efficiency. "Overwatch, this is Falcon 1. We have multiple enemy units maneuvering for position. Estimate company strength force, possibly more. We can hold current position for approximately 4 hours before ammunition becomes critical." The response crackled through his earpiece immediately. "Falcon 1, this is Overwatch. Be advised, extraction asset is currently en route to your position. Estimated time of arrival is 3 hours. Can you maintain position until then?" "Roger, Overwatch. We'll be here." Kane tried to keep the skepticism out of his voice, but he knew the odds. The airstrip below their position was completely flooded, making helicopter extraction impossible in the current weather. He had no idea what kind of extraction asset could possibly reach them under these conditions, but he had learned long ago not to question miracles when lives were on the line. Kane's team consisted of 7 other elite operators, each one a veteran of multiple combat deployments. They had been inserted into the region 72 hours earlier to conduct surveillance on a high-value target believed to be coordinating attacks against coalition forces. The intelligence had been solid, and they had successfully gathered the information needed to plan future operations. But intelligence gathering was only half the mission. The extraction phase was always the most dangerous part of any deep reconnaissance operation, and this one had gone sideways in the worst possible way. Their helicopter extraction had been forced to abort when enemy forces opened fire with heavy machine guns and rocket-propelled grenades. The pilot had barely escaped with his aircraft intact, leaving the SEAL team stranded deep in hostile territory. Movement on the north perimeter, reported Petty Officer Second Class David Kim from his position near the base of the tower. Kim was responsible for monitoring the team's 6 o'clock, and his warning meant that the enemy was attempting to surround their position completely. I see at least a dozen fighters moving through the old barracks area. The abandoned airbase had once been a significant Soviet installation during their occupation of Afghanistan in the 1980s. Concrete buildings and infrastructure were scattered across the valley floor, providing both defensive positions for Kane's team and concealment for the approaching enemy forces. The Soviets had built the facility to last, with thick concrete walls that could withstand artillery bombardment. Now those same walls were providing life-saving protection for 8 American warriors. Kane quickly assessed their tactical situation. The control tower offered excellent visibility and fields of fire in all directions, but it also made them an obvious target. The enemy would eventually bring up heavy weapons or explosives to blast them out of their stronghold. Their only advantages were superior training, better equipment, and the natural reluctance of the Taliban fighters to assault a well-defended position without overwhelming numerical superiority. "Listen up," Kane said over the team's internal communication net. "We've got hostiles moving on multiple vectors. I want overlapping fields of fire on all approaches. Save your ammunition and make every shot count. Help is coming, but we need to buy them time to reach us." Petty Officer 3rd Class Miguel Santos was monitoring the team's radio frequencies when he picked up an interesting transmission. "Chief, I'm hearing chatter on the enemy frequency. Sounds like they're arguing about something. My Pashto isn't perfect, but I think they're debating whether to wait for reinforcements or attack now." Kane nodded grimly. The Taliban commanders were probably weighing the benefits of a quick assault against the risk of heavy casualties. They knew that time was on their side. The longer they waited, the more fighters would arrive to tip the odds in their favor. But they also knew that the Americans had called for help, and any delay might allow rescue forces to arrive. "What's our ammunition status?" Kane asked, performing a mental calculation of their remaining firepower. "I've got 4 magazines left for the Barrett," Morrison reported. "That's about 40 rounds of .50 caliber. 6 mags for the SAW," added Petty Officer 1st Class Tony Rodriguez, patting his M249 squad automatic weapon. The belt-fed machine gun was their primary base of fire weapon, capable of laying down sustained suppressive fire against multiple targets. The rest of the team reported similar ammunition counts. They had enough firepower for 1 major engagement, maybe 2 if they were careful with their shots. After that, they would be reduced to their sidearms and whatever weapons they could salvage from fallen enemies. Kane looked out through the shattered window at the flooded airstrip below. The concrete runway was completely submerged under several feet of muddy water that reflected the gray storm clouds overhead. Debris from the surrounding area had been swept across the landing surface, creating a chaotic mixture of vegetation, rocks, and twisted metal. It looked like a lake had suddenly appeared where an airfield used to be. The weather was definitely not improving. Rain continued to fall in heavy sheets, reducing visibility to a few hundred meters and making movement difficult for both sides. But Kane knew that weather could be a double-edged sword. While it might hinder their enemy's ability to coordinate attacks, it would also make any rescue operation exponentially more dangerous. "Chief, I've got movement on the main access road," reported Petty Officer 2nd Class Alex Thompson from his observation post on the tower's eastern side. Thompson was the team's communications specialist, but, like all SEALs, he was cross-trained in multiple specialties. "Looks like a truck convoy heading our way. I count 3 vehicles, possibly more behind them." Kane grabbed his binoculars and moved to Thompson's position. Through the rain and mist, he could make out the dark shapes of vehicles moving slowly along the flooded road that led to the airbase. The lead truck appeared to be a Soviet-era UAZ military vehicle, probably carrying 8 to 10 fighters. If there were 3 trucks, that meant at least 24 additional enemies would soon be in the fight. "How long before they reach the perimeter?" Kane asked. "At their current speed, maybe 20 minutes, Thompson estimated. The road is pretty torn up from the flooding, so they're having to move carefully." 20 minutes. Kane did the math quickly in his head. By the time the convoy reached the airbase, they would be facing at least 50 enemy fighters, possibly more. The odds were becoming increasingly unfavorable, but giving up was not an option. They would fight until the last round was expended and then continue fighting with whatever weapons they could find. All stations, this is Falcon 1. Kane broadcast on their tactical frequency. We have enemy reinforcements approaching from the east. Estimate 20 to 30 additional hostiles will be in the fight within 20 mics. Adjust your positions accordingly and prepare for sustained contact. The team acknowledged his transmission with calm professionalism. These men had been in desperate situations before, and they knew that panic was more dangerous than any enemy. They would do their jobs with the same methodical efficiency they had demonstrated in dozens of previous missions. Kane keyed his radio to contact their Overwatch controller. Overwatch, this is Falcon 1. Sitrep as follows. We are in contact with approximately company-strength enemy force. Additional reinforcements approaching our position. We can hold for approximately 2 hours before our situation becomes untenable. Request immediate update on extraction timeline. The response came back within seconds. Falcon 1, extraction asset is currently airborne and en route to your position. Estimated arrival time is now 2 hours and 15 minutes. Asset is a C-130 transport aircraft with special operations capability. Kane frowned. A C-130 transport? How is a large cargo aircraft supposed to extract them from a flooded airstrip in the middle of enemy territory? The runway was completely underwater, making conventional landing procedures impossible. Either the Overwatch controller had lost his mind, or there was something about this extraction plan that defied conventional military logic. Overwatch, be advised that landing conditions at this location are extremely hazardous, Kane transmitted. Runway is completely flooded with several feet of standing water. Debris and obstacles present significant safety concerns. Understood, Falcon 1. Extraction pilot is aware of conditions and has volunteered to attempt the mission. Recommend you prepare landing zone to the best of your ability. Kane looked down at the flooded airstrip and shook his head. Prepare the landing zone? How was he supposed to prepare a runway that was completely underwater? But orders were orders, and if some crazy pilot was willing to attempt a landing under these conditions, the least he could do was provide whatever assistance possible. Rodriguez, Santos, Kane called out. I need you two to conduct a reconnaissance of the airstrip. See if there are any major obstacles that we can clear or mark. Be careful, the enemy might have the same idea about using that area for observation. The two SEALs acknowledged the order and began preparing for their movement to the flooded runway. It would be dangerous to leave their fortified position, but gathering intelligence about the landing conditions might mean the difference between successful extraction and disaster. Meanwhile, the sound of gunfire was becoming more frequent as enemy forces tested their defensive perimeter. Single shots echoed across the valley as Morrison engaged targets of opportunity with his sniper rifle, each shot carefully aimed to achieve maximum effect with minimum ammunition expenditure. Contact front. Rodriguez suddenly shouted as he opened fire with his saw. The distinctive sound of the belt-fed weapon filled the air as he engaged a group of fighters attempting to advance through the old maintenance area. Brass casings scattered across the concrete floor as the machine gun chattered out controlled bursts. Kane moved to Rodriguez's position and observed the tactical situation. A dozen enemy fighters were using the abandoned buildings for cover as they attempted to close the distance to the control tower. They were moving with reasonable tactical discipline, but their equipment and training were clearly inferior to that of the SEAL team. I count 12 hostiles in Sector 3, Kane reported. They're trying to use the buildings for cover, but they're exposing themselves during movement. Morrison's rifle cracked twice in rapid succession, and 2 of the advancing fighters dropped immediately. The others dove for cover, temporarily halting their advance. But Kane knew this was just the beginning. The enemy was testing their defenses, looking for weaknesses, and gathering intelligence about their firepower and positions. The radio crackled with another transmission from Santos and Rodriguez, who had reached the edge of the flooded airstrip. Falcon 1, this is Santos. The runway is in worse condition than we thought. Water depth varies from 3 to 4 feet, and there's a lot of debris scattered across the surface. I can see pieces of concrete, metal sheeting, and what looks like part of an old aircraft. Can you mark any major obstacles? Kane asked. Negative, Chief. Too much area to cover, and we're starting to take small arms fire from the south. Looks like the enemy is moving observers into position around the airstrip perimeter. Kane cursed under his breath. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Enemy forces were positioning themselves around the entire airbase, making it almost impossible to clear or secure a landing zone. Whatever pilot was attempting this rescue would be flying into a combat zone with minimal ground support and essentially no preparation. All stations, this is Falcon 1. Fall back to primary defensive positions. We're going to have to trust that our extraction pilot knows what he's doing. As Santos and Rodriguez made their way back to the control tower under sporadic enemy fire, Kane reflected on the bizarre nature of their situation. In all his years of military service, he had never heard of a C-130 attempting to land on a flooded runway in hostile territory. It sounded like something out of a Hollywood action movie rather than a legitimate military operation. But then, again, Special Operations Forces had built their reputation on doing the impossible. Maybe this mysterious pilot had training or experience that made such a mission feasible. Kane had seen enough unconventional operations to know that sometimes the most unlikely plans were the ones that succeeded. The convoy of enemy vehicles had reached the outer perimeter of the airbase and was disgorging additional fighters. Kane could see muzzle flashes from multiple positions as the enemy began to coordinate their assault. The volume of incoming fire was increasing steadily, forcing his team to remain undercover most of the time. "Chief, I'm picking up radio chatter about heavy weapons," Thompson reported from his monitoring position. "Sounds like they're bringing up mortars or rocket-propelled grenades." That was the news Kane had been dreading. Once the enemy brought indirect fire weapons into the fight, the control tower would become untenable as a defensive position. The concrete walls could withstand small arms fire, but they wouldn't provide protection against high explosive rounds. Kane keyed his radio one more time. "Overwatch, this is Falcon 1. Enemy forces are bringing up heavy weapons. Our position will be compromised within the next hour. Strongly recommend that extraction asset expedite timeline if possible." "Roger, Falcon 1. Extraction pilot has been advised of the tactical situation. ETA remains 2 hours. 2 hours. Kane looked around at his 7 teammates, each one focused on their individual responsibilities despite the deteriorating situation. They would hold their position for as long as humanly possible, but the mathematics of warfare were working against them. Eventually, the enemy would achieve sufficient numerical superiority to overwhelm their defenses. The only question was whether their mysterious rescue pilot would arrive in time, and whether a C-130 could actually land on a flooded runway in the middle of a firefight. Kane had his doubts about both possibilities, but he had learned long ago that doubt was a luxury that warriors couldn't afford. Sometimes you just had to have faith that the impossible was possible, and that help would arrive when you needed it most. The sound of approaching aircraft engines would either signal their salvation or the beginning of a very long day indeed. Captain Maria Rodriguez adjusted her grip on the yoke as turbulence shook the massive C-130 Hercules. She was flying at 8,000 feet through the heart of the storm system, and the aircraft was taking a beating from wind shears and downdrafts that would have grounded lesser planes. Rain hammered against the windscreen with such intensity that visibility was reduced to near zero, forcing her to rely entirely on instruments for navigation. "Phoenix 1, this is Overwatch," came the voice through her headset. "Be advised that ground tactical situation is deteriorating. Enemy forces are increasing pressure on Falcon 1's position. Estimated time remaining before position is overrun is 90 minutes. Maria glanced at her navigation display. She was still 45 minutes out from the target area, which meant the timing would be critically close. If she encountered any delays or complications during the approach, the SEALs might be overwhelmed before she could reach them. Overwatch, Phoenix 1 copies. Request immediate weather update for target area. Phoenix 1, current conditions at target are winds from the southwest at 25 knots gusting to 40, visibility 1 mile in heavy rain, ceiling indefinite. Surface conditions remain flooded with standing water depth estimated at 3 to 4 feet across the runway surface. Maria did some quick mental calculations. A 25-knot crosswind would make the landing approach extremely challenging under normal conditions. With a flooded runway eliminating normal braking and steering capabilities, those wind conditions moved the mission from dangerous to nearly suicidal. But the word nearly was important. Maria had spent countless hours studying the aerodynamics and performance characteristics of the C-130, and she knew that the aircraft had capabilities that weren't immediately obvious to most pilots. The key would be using every one of those capabilities to their absolute maximum potential. Technical Sergeant Mike Patterson, her loadmaster, moved forward from the cargo bay, and strapped himself into the seat behind her. Patterson had flown with Maria on dozens of missions, and she trusted his judgment completely. If anyone could help her figure out how to make this impossible landing work, it was him. "Ma'am, I've been thinking about the loading sequence for the passengers," Patterson said, raising his voice to be heard over the engine noise and storm. "If we're going to be on the ground for the absolute minimum time possible, we need to have everything ready for immediate loading." Maria nodded. "What's your recommendation?" "I suggest we configure the cargo bay for rapid personnel loading. Remove all unnecessary equipment, lower the ramp partially before landing to reduce loading time, and have the engines at flight idle rather than ground idle for immediate takeoff capability." It was a good plan, but it created additional complications. Landing with the cargo ramp partially lowered would affect the aircraft's aerodynamics and make the approach even more difficult. Keeping the engines at flight idle would reduce their ability to use reverse thrust for braking, which was already compromised by the flooded runway. "The trade-offs might be worth it," Maria agreed. "If we can reduce ground time by even 2 or 3 minutes, that could make the difference between success and disaster." She keyed her radio to contact the SEAL team directly. "Falcon 1, this is Phoenix 1. I'm your extraction pilot. Request immediate briefing on ground tactical situation and any obstacles in the landing area." Senior Chief Kane's voice came back immediately, calm and professional despite the obvious sound of gunfire in the background. "Phoenix 1, we are currently engaged with approximately 50 enemy combatants. They have positioned forces around the entire perimeter of the airbase. The runway is completely flooded with debris scattered throughout. We attempted to conduct reconnaissance of the landing area, but were driven back by enemy fire." "Understood, Falcon 1. What is your current ammunition status?" "We have approximately 40 minutes of sustained combat capability remaining. After that, our options become very limited." 40 minutes. Maria checked her navigation display again. Even if everything went perfectly, she would arrive at the target area with only 15 minutes to spare. There was no margin for error, no time for multiple landing attempts or extended ground operations. "Falcon 1, I need you to understand the nature of this extraction. I'm going to attempt a landing on your flooded runway, but it's never been done before. There's a significant possibility that I'll crash on landing and be unable to extract you." There was a pause before Kane responded. "Phoenix 1, we understand and appreciate the risk you're taking. We'll be ready for immediate boarding regardless of the outcome." The professionalism in Kane's voice was reassuring. These were elite warriors who had faced impossible odds before, and they wouldn't panic or lose focus regardless of how the situation developed. If Maria could get her aircraft on the ground in one piece, they would be aboard and ready for takeoff within minutes. "Patterson, I need you to run through our emergency procedures one more time," Maria said. "If we crash on landing, what's our immediate action sequence?" "Emergency shutdown of all engines. Activate emergency locator beacon, and prepare for ground defense until rescue forces arrive," Patterson recited. "But, ma'am, if we crash in that location, rescue forces might not be able to reach us for days or weeks." Maria was well aware of that sobering reality. If she misjudged the landing and crashed, she would simply become the 9th person trapped behind enemy lines instead of the solution to their problem. The enemy forces would eventually overrun the crash site, and both she and the SEAL team would be captured or killed. The aircraft shuddered violently as it hit another pocket of severe turbulence. Maria fought to maintain control as the C-130 was tossed around like a toy in the hands of the storm. Outside the windows, she could see nothing but gray clouds and sheets of rain. Lightning flashed occasionally, illuminating the massive thunderheads that surrounded their flight path. "Phoenix 1, this is Overwatch. Be advised that satellite intelligence indicates additional enemy forces are moving toward the target area. Total hostile strength is now estimated at company level, possibly reinforced." The situation on the ground was continuing to deteriorate. Maria knew that once enemy numbers reached a certain threshold, even the most elite special operations team would be unable to hold their position. The SEALs were running out of time, ammunition, and options. She began her descent toward the target area, carefully monitoring her instruments as the aircraft descended through the storm layers. The turbulence gradually decreased as she got below the worst of the weather, but visibility remained extremely poor due to the heavy rain and low clouds. "Target area is now 15 miles ahead," Maria announced. Beginning approach preparation. She started configuring the aircraft for landing, extending flaps, and adjusting power settings for the final approach. But instead of following normal landing procedures, she was preparing for something that had never been attempted before. Every decision she made from this point forward would either save 9 lives or doom them all. Falcon 1, Phoenix 1 is now 10 miles out. What is your current tactical situation? Phoenix 1, we are in heavy contact. Enemy forces have begun their final assault on our position. We can hold for approximately 20 more minutes before we're overrun. 20 minutes. Maria pushed the throttles forward slightly, increasing her approach speed. She was already flying faster than normal landing speeds, but time was more critical than perfect technique. If she could reach the airfield even 5 minutes sooner, it might make the difference between success and catastrophe. The mountains began to emerge from the clouds ahead of her, their jagged peaks barely visible through the rain and mist. The valley containing the abandoned airbase was still hidden somewhere in the maze of ridges and ravines, but Maria's navigation system indicated she was on the correct heading. I have the valley in sight, she announced as the terrain features became clearer. Beginning final approach. What she saw below made her stomach clench with apprehension. The entire valley floor was covered with floodwater that reflected the gray sky like a mirror. The abandoned airbase was partially submerged, with only the tops of buildings and the control tower visible above the waterline. The runway was completely invisible beneath several feet of murky water. Most terrifying of all were the muzzle flashes visible around the perimeter of the flooded airbase. The SEAL team was engaged in a desperate firefight against overwhelming odds, and Maria was about to fly directly into the middle of it. Falcon 1, I have visual contact with your position. I can see the engagement area. Where do you want me to land? Phoenix 1, the runway runs east-west through the center of the valley. We're in the control tower at the eastern end. Recommend you approach from the west to minimize exposure to enemy fire. Maria studied the flooded landing area from her current altitude. The runway was completely submerged, but she could make out its general outline by the way the flood water followed the original contours of the pavement. Debris was scattered everywhere, pieces of concrete, metal sheeting, and what looked like parts of old aircraft. Patterson, are you ready for emergency passenger loading? Ready, ma'am. Cargo bay is configured, and ramp is positioned for immediate deployment. Maria began her final approach, lining up with the invisible runway beneath the floodwater. She had to trust her instruments and her knowledge of the airfield layout, because visual references were almost non-existent. The approach angle was steeper than normal to account for the obstacles and to minimize her time exposed to ground fire. Falcon 1, be advised I am now on final approach. Recommend you prepare for immediate movement to the aircraft upon landing. Roger, Phoenix 1. We are ready. The altimeter showed 500 feet above ground level and decreasing rapidly. Maria could now clearly see the individual buildings of the abandoned airbase, many of them partially submerged in the floodwater. The control tower where the SEALs were positioned was taking visible hits from enemy fire, with concrete chips flying from the walls. At 200 feet, she could make out the surface of the floodwater in detail. It was rough and choppy from the wind and rain, with debris creating obstacles that could destroy the aircraft's landing gear or fuselage. The water depth appeared to vary across the runway area, creating an unpredictable surface that would challenge every assumption about normal landing procedures. At 100 feet, Maria committed to the landing. There was no longer any possibility of aborting the approach, because doing so would simply condemn the SEAL team to death or capture. She was going to put the aircraft on that flooded runway regardless of the consequences, and then deal with whatever happened next. Hold on, she said to Patterson. This is going to be interesting. The surface of the flood water rushed up to meet them as Maria prepared to attempt something that had never been done before in the history of military aviation. In a few seconds, she would discover whether courage and skill could overcome the laws of physics, or whether some things truly were impossible. The fate of 9 lives hung in the balance as the massive C-130 descended toward the flooded runway in the middle of a combat zone, with enemy forces closing in from all directions and time running out for everyone involved. The massive wheels of the C-130 Hercules touched the surface of the floodwater at exactly 120 knots, sending up twin geysers of muddy spray that obscured Maria's vision completely. For a terrifying moment, she was flying blind as the aircraft's landing gear disappeared into the submerged runway, and she had no idea whether the pavement beneath the water would hold or if they were about to cartwheel into the surrounding terrain. The initial impact was unlike anything she had experienced before. Instead of the solid thump of wheels contacting concrete, there was a strange sliding sensation as the aircraft's weight settled onto the flooded surface. The nose gear hit a submerged piece of debris and kicked violently to the right, threatening to send the massive transport aircraft into an uncontrollable ground loop. Maria fought the controls with everything she had, using differential braking and rudder input to try to maintain directional control. But the laws of physics were working against her. Without friction between the wheels and a solid surface, normal steering techniques were useless. The C-130 was essentially hydroplaning across the flooded runway at over 100 miles per hour, and Maria had to invent new techniques on the fly. "Reverse thrust," she shouted to Patterson, even though he couldn't help with the engine controls. She pulled the power levers back and activated the propeller reverse system, feeling the aircraft shudder as 4 massive propellers began pulling air forward instead of pushing it back. The reverse thrust provided some deceleration, but not nearly enough to stop the aircraft before they reached the end of the runway. Through the water spray and rain-soaked windscreen, Maria caught glimpses of the abandoned airbase buildings flashing past at alarming speed. They were still moving too fast, and the eastern end of the runway was approaching rapidly. If she couldn't get the aircraft stopped soon, they would crash into the mountains beyond the airfield. That's when inspiration struck. Maria had trained extensively on short-field landing techniques, and one of the most effective methods for rapid deceleration was ground effect manipulation. By using the aircraft's flaps and elevator controls, she could create aerodynamic drag that would supplement the limited braking available from the flooded runway. She pulled back on the yoke while simultaneously deploying full flaps, essentially trying to make the aircraft want to fly again while it was still on the ground. The technique created enormous drag as the wings fought against the aircraft's forward momentum. Combined with maximum reverse thrust, it began to slow their headlong rush toward disaster. But they were still moving dangerously fast as they approached the control tower where the SEALs were positioned. Maria could see muzzle flashes from multiple directions as the firefight continued to rage around the airbase perimeter. Enemy rounds were now impacting near the aircraft, adding the threat of battle damage to an already impossible situation. "Come on, stop," Maria whispered through gritted teeth as she fought to bring the massive transport under control. The end of the runway was now clearly visible through the rain, marked by a line of concrete barriers that the Soviets had installed decades earlier. If the C-130 hit those barriers at high speed, the impact would destroy the aircraft and kill everyone aboard. At the last possible moment, Maria felt the wheels finally find purchase on something solid beneath the floodwater. The aircraft lurched violently as the landing gear contacted the concrete runway surface, and suddenly, she had partial braking capability. She stood on the brake pedals with all her strength, feeling the aircraft shudder and skid as the anti-lock braking system tried to prevent the wheels from locking up completely. The C-130 came to a stop less than 50 feet from the concrete barriers, with the nose of the aircraft pointing toward the mountains and the cargo ramp facing the control tower where the SEALs were trapped. Maria sat in stunned silence for a moment, hardly believing that they had survived the landing. Her hands were shaking from adrenaline and exhaustion, and every muscle in her body ached from fighting the controls. "Patterson, get that ramp down now," she commanded, knowing that their survival depended on getting the SEALs aboard and getting airborne again as quickly as possible. The longer they remained on the ground, the more likely it became that enemy forces would overrun their position or score a lucky hit with a rocket-propelled grenade. "Ramp coming down," Patterson replied, activating the hydraulic system that lowered the massive cargo ramp. The sound of the ramp motor was audible even over the engine noise and the continuing gunfire from around the perimeter. Maria keyed her radio immediately. "Falcon 1, Phoenix 1 is on the ground. We are ready for immediate passenger loading. Move now." The response from Senior Chief Kane was immediate. "Phoenix 1, Falcon 1 is moving to your position. Cover us." Through her side window, Maria could see the SEAL team as they burst from the control tower and began sprinting across the flooded ground toward the aircraft. They moved with the fluid precision of elite warriors, covering each other as they bounded from one piece of cover to the next. Even while conducting a fighting withdrawal under enemy fire, their tactical discipline was perfect. But the enemy forces had also recognized the significance of the aircraft's arrival. The volume of incoming fire increased dramatically as Taliban fighters realized that their quarry was attempting to escape. Muzzle flashes erupted from multiple positions around the airbase as enemy combatants tried to prevent the SEALs from reaching the aircraft. Maria watched in horror as enemy rounds began impacting around the running SEALs. Geysers of muddy water erupted where bullets struck the flooded ground, and she could hear the distinctive crack of rounds passing close to their targets. The distance from the control tower to the aircraft was only about 200 meters, but it might as well have been 2 miles under these conditions. "Patterson, do we have any defensive armament on this bird?" Maria asked, knowing that standard C-130 transports weren't equipped with weapons, but hoping for some kind of emergency capability. "Negative, ma'am. But I've got a rifle from the crew survival kit if that helps." It wouldn't help much against company-strength enemy forces, but Maria appreciated Patterson's willingness to fight. She watched anxiously as the first SEAL reached the aircraft and dove through the open cargo ramp. 6 more were still in the open, with Senior Chief Kane bringing up the rear as he provided covering fire for his team. That's when disaster struck. Maria saw the muzzle flash from an enemy position near the old maintenance buildings, followed immediately by the distinctive whoosh sound of a rocket-propelled grenade in flight. The RPG round streaked across the flooded airbase directly toward the clustered SEALs, and there was no cover available in the open ground between the control tower and the aircraft. The explosion sent up a massive column of water and debris as the RPG round impacted just 20 feet from the running SEALs. The blast knocked 2 of them down, and Maria lost sight of them in the spray and confusion. For a terrifying moment, she thought they had been killed or seriously wounded. But then, she saw movement as the 2 SEALs struggled back to their feet and continued toward the aircraft. They were moving more slowly now, obviously injured, but they were still mobile and fighting. The other members of the team immediately adjusted their formation to provide additional support for their wounded teammates. "Patterson, get ready to provide medical aid," Maria commanded. "We've got wounded coming aboard." "Roger, ma'am. First aid kit is ready." More RPG rounds began impacting around the aircraft as the enemy fighters realized they had a limited window of opportunity to prevent the extraction. Maria could feel the C-130 shaking from the nearby explosions, and she knew that it was only a matter of time before a lucky hit would damage something critical. "Engines staying hot," she announced, keeping the throttles at flight idle power settings. If they took significant battle damage, she wanted maximum available power for an emergency takeoff attempt. The aircraft was already configured for immediate departure, with flaps set and systems ready for flight. The 6th SEAL dove through the cargo ramp opening, followed closely by the 7th. That left only Senior Chief Kane still in the open, and he was clearly the primary target for every enemy weapon in the area. Automatic weapons fire was converging on his position from multiple directions as he covered the final 30 meters to the aircraft. Kane moved with the fluid grace of a combat veteran, using every piece of available cover and changing direction unpredictably to spoil enemy aim points. But Maria could see that he was running out of options. The open area immediately around the aircraft offered no concealment, and enemy fire was becoming more accurate as the range decreased. "Come on, Chief," Patterson shouted from the cargo ramp, ready to provide covering fire with his survival rifle if necessary. Kane made his final sprint toward the aircraft as enemy rounds cracked past his head and impacted in the flood water around his feet. He reached the cargo ramp at a dead run and dove inside the aircraft just as another RPG round exploded against the concrete barrier behind them. "Everyone aboard," Patterson reported. "Ramp coming up." Maria didn't wait for the ramp to fully retract before beginning her takeoff roll. She pushed the throttles forward to take off power and felt the 4 turboprop engines respond with a surge of power that shook the entire aircraft. The C-130 began moving forward through the floodwater, slowly at first but gaining speed as the propellers bit into the dense air. But taking off from a flooded runway presented even more challenges than landing had. Without solid contact between the wheels and the pavement, the aircraft had to essentially fly itself off the water surface using pure aerodynamic lift. Maria had to maintain precise control inputs to prevent the aircraft from settling back into the water or losing directional control during the critical transition from surface operations to flight. Enemy fire continued to impact around the aircraft as it gained speed through the floodwater. Maria could hear rounds striking the fuselage and wings, but the C-130 was built to withstand battle damage and continued to accelerate despite the hits. She watched the airspeed indicator climb slowly toward the speed needed for takeoff. The eastern end of the runway was approaching rapidly, marked by the same concrete barriers that had nearly ended their mission during landing. Maria knew that she had to get the aircraft airborne before reaching those obstacles, or the attempted rescue would end in disaster. At 80 knots, she began applying back pressure to the yoke, trying to coax the heavily loaded aircraft into the air. The C-130 was carrying 8 additional passengers plus their equipment, putting the aircraft close to maximum gross weight limits. Combined with the short runway and adverse conditions, it was going to be a very marginal takeoff performance. At 90 knots, Maria felt the first tentative signs that the aircraft wanted to fly. The nose wheel began to lift slightly as the elevators began to generate lift, but the main landing gear was still firmly planted in the floodwater. She needed at least 100 knots before attempting to lift off completely. At 95 knots, with the concrete barriers now clearly visible ahead, Maria made the decision to attempt takeoff regardless of whether the aircraft was technically ready. If she waited any longer, they would run out of runway and crash anyway. She pulled back on the yoke with all her strength, demanding that the C-130 leave the surface whether it wanted to or not. The aircraft responded reluctantly, lifting clear of the floodwater just as the landing gear passed over the concrete barriers with mere feet to spare. But they weren't clear yet. The mountains beyond the airfield rose to over 10,000 feet, and the heavily loaded aircraft was struggling to gain altitude in the thin air and severe weather conditions. Maria kept the aircraft in ground effect as long as possible, using the aerodynamic benefits of flying close to the surface to build up airspeed before beginning her climb. Enemy fire continued to reach toward them from the ground, but the range was increasing rapidly as they gained distance from the airbase. Phoenix 1 is airborne with all passengers aboard, Maria transmitted to Overwatch. We have wounded personnel who need immediate medical attention upon landing. Roger, Phoenix 1. Outstanding work. Medical personnel will be standing by at Kandahar. Maria finally allowed herself a moment to appreciate what they had accomplished. Against all odds and conventional wisdom, she had successfully landed a C-130 transport aircraft on a flooded runway in hostile territory and extracted 8 Navy SEALs from certain death or capture. It was a mission that would be talked about in military aviation circles for decades to come. But the mission wasn't over yet. They still had to navigate back through the storm system and land safely at their home base. As Maria climbed toward cruise altitude, she knew that the hardest part was behind them, but vigilance would be required until they were safely on the ground at Kandahar. In the cargo bay behind her, medics were already working on the wounded SEALs while their teammates provided detailed briefings on the intelligence they had gathered during their mission. The information they carried would help save countless coalition lives in future operations, making their rescue even more significant from a strategic perspective. As the Afghan mountains disappeared into the clouds behind them, Maria reflected on the thin line between success and disaster that had defined their entire mission. A few seconds' delay, a mechanical malfunction, or slightly different weather conditions could have changed the outcome completely. Sometimes courage and skill were enough to overcome seemingly impossible odds, but luck had also played a crucial role in their survival. The important thing was that 9 people who might have died that day were now heading home to their families. In the end, that was what really mattered. The C-130 Hercules emerged from the storm clouds into brilliant Afghan sunshine as Captain Maria Rodriguez leveled off at cruise altitude. Behind her, the mountains where 8 Navy SEALs had nearly died were already disappearing into the distance. But the reality of what they had accomplished was only beginning to sink in. She had just completed what aviation experts would later call one of the most extraordinary rescue missions in military history. Technical Sergeant Patterson moved forward from the cargo bay, his face showing a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. "Ma'am, the medics have stabilized the 2 wounded SEALs. Both have shrapnel wounds from the RPG blast, but they're going to be fine. The senior chief wants to speak with you when you have a moment." Maria nodded, keeping her attention focused on the flight instruments as she monitored their progress toward Kandahar. The aircraft had sustained multiple bullet holes during the extraction, but all systems were functioning normally, and there were no signs of critical damage. The rugged construction of the C-130 had once again proven its worth in combat conditions. "Tell him I'll be back to speak with the team once we're established in level flight," Maria replied. She wanted to ensure that their return flight was completely stable before leaving the controls, even though they were now in relatively safe airspace. The radio crackled with a transmission from Overwatch. Phoenix 1, be advised that your mission has generated significant interest at the highest levels. The Pentagon has been monitoring this operation closely, and there will likely be extensive debriefings upon your return. Maria wasn't surprised. A successful landing on a flooded runway had never been accomplished before, and military aviation experts would want to understand exactly how it had been possible. The techniques she had developed during the mission could potentially save lives in future operations, assuming anyone else was crazy enough to attempt similar landings. Overwatch, Phoenix 1 requests priority handling for medical evacuation upon landing at Kandahar. We have 2 walking wounded who need immediate attention. Roger, Phoenix 1. Medical personnel are already standing by, and you're cleared for straight-in approach to runway 05. Emergency vehicles will be positioned along the runway as a precautionary measure. 20 minutes later, Maria was on final approach to Kandahar, flying a textbook landing pattern that seemed almost boring after the chaos of the flooded runway extraction. The familiar sight of the sprawling air base appeared ahead, with its long concrete runways and organized flight operations that represented safety and normalcy after their harrowing mission. As the C-130 touched down on solid concrete, Maria felt a wave of relief wash over her. They were home, and everyone was alive. The contrast between this routine landing and the impossible challenge they had faced just hours earlier was almost surreal. The aircraft rolled to a stop near the medical facility, where ambulances and medical personnel were already waiting. Maria shut down the engines and secured the aircraft systems before finally allowing herself to relax. Her hands were still shaking slightly from the adrenaline that had sustained her throughout the mission. Patterson lowered the cargo ramp, and Maria watched as the wounded SEALs were carefully transferred to stretchers and loaded into ambulances. Despite their injuries, both men were conscious and alert, testament to their physical conditioning and mental toughness. The other 6 SEALs gathered their equipment and prepared to be transported to debriefing facilities. Senior Chief Kane approached Maria as she exited the cockpit. Despite everything he had been through in the past 12 hours, he looked alert and professional, ready for the next mission if necessary. His weathered face showed the strain of combat, but his eyes were clear and focused. Captain Rodriguez, Kane said, extending his hand. I need to thank you for what you did back there. In 20 years of military service, I've never seen anything like that landing. You saved 8 lives today. Maria shook his hand, feeling the callous strength of a warrior who had spent his career serving others. Senior Chief, you and your team were the ones who held that position against overwhelming odds. I just provided transportation. Kane smiled grimly. Ma'am, with all due respect, what you did was a lot more than transportation. Landing a C-130 on a flooded runway in a combat zone isn't in any pilot manual I've ever read. You invented a new technique under the most extreme conditions imaginable. As they walked toward the debriefing facilities, Kane provided Maria with more details about the tactical situation they had faced. The intelligence his team had gathered was considered critical for ongoing operations in the region, and their successful extraction had prevented that information from falling into enemy hands. The target we were observing has been coordinating attacks against coalition forces for months, Kane explained. The intelligence we gathered will allow special operations units to disrupt his network and potentially capture or eliminate him. Your rescue mission may have saved dozens of coalition lives in the long run. The debriefing process took several hours as intelligence officers, flight safety investigators, and aviation experts questioned Maria about every aspect of the mission. They were particularly interested in the specific techniques she had used to maintain control of the aircraft during landing and takeoff operations on the flooded runway. Captain, can you describe the exact power settings and control inputs you used during the landing flare? Asked Major General Patricia Collins, the senior aviation safety officer for the theater. Our preliminary analysis suggests that what you accomplished should have been aerodynamically impossible. Maria explained her decision-making process, describing how she had adapted standard short-field landing techniques to account for the unique challenges of a flooded runway. She had essentially treated the water surface as an extremely slippery runway, using aerodynamic drag rather than wheel braking as the primary means of deceleration. The key was maintaining just enough airspeed to preserve control authority while using maximum reverse thrust and aerodynamic drag to slow the aircraft, Maria explained. Traditional braking techniques were useless, so I had to rely entirely on engine power and flight controls. The investigators were fascinated by her improvised techniques, particularly her use of ground effect manipulation during the takeoff phase. By keeping the aircraft in ground effect while building airspeed, she had been able to maximize lift generation in the critical transition from surface operations to sustained flight. "Have you considered writing up these procedures as a new emergency technique?" asked Colonel Robert Hayes from the Air Force Test Pilot School. "What you've developed could potentially be useful in other emergency situations involving compromised runways." Maria hadn't considered the broader implications of her techniques, but she realized that Hayes was right. Emergency landings on flooded runways might become necessary in humanitarian missions or natural disaster responses. The procedures she had developed under extreme pressure could potentially save lives in future operations. Later that evening, Maria found herself in the base hospital visiting the 2 wounded SEALs. Both men were in stable condition and expected to make full recoveries, but they would be evacuated to Germany for additional medical treatment and rehabilitation. Petty Officer Morrison looked up as Maria entered his room. Despite the bandages covering his shrapnel wounds, he managed to smile. "Captain, I heard you're getting some serious recognition for what you did today. It's well-deserved. How are you feeling?" Maria asked, pulling up a chair beside his bed. "Like I got hit by a truck, but I'm alive," Morrison replied. "That counts for a lot in my book." "Ma'am, I've been in some tight spots before, but when we saw your aircraft coming through that storm, it was like watching a miracle happen. None of us really believed anyone could land on that flooded runway." Maria spent a few minutes talking with both wounded SEALs, learning about their families and their plans for recovery. These were men who had volunteered for the most dangerous missions imaginable, and their courage and dedication reminded her why she had chosen military service. As she left the hospital, Maria reflected on the events of the day. In the space of a few hours, she had gone from a routine transport mission to attempting something that had never been done before in military aviation. The successful outcome had depended on split-second decisions, improvised techniques, and a significant amount of luck. But, perhaps most importantly, it had demonstrated the lengths to which military personnel would go to support each other. She had risked her life to save 8 SEALs, just as they had risked theirs to gather intelligence that would protect coalition forces. It was part of an unbroken chain of mutual support that defined military service at its best. 3 weeks later, Maria stood in the Pentagon briefing room as General Michael Thompson, Chief of Staff of the Air Force, pinned the Distinguished Flying Cross on her uniform. The citation read in part, "For extraordinary achievement while participating in aerial flight as pilot of a C-130H aircraft during a combat rescue mission in Afghanistan. Captain Rodriguez demonstrated exceptional piloting skills and personal courage by successfully landing on a flooded runway under hostile fire to extract 8 Navy SEALs from certain death or capture." The ceremony was attended by senior officials from across the military, including several of the SEALs she had rescued. Senior Chief Kane was among them, having returned from medical leave to resume his duties with SEAL Team 6. The intelligence his team had gathered had indeed led to successful operations against the terrorist network they had been investigating. After the ceremony, Maria was approached by Dr. Sarah Mitchell from the Air Force Research Laboratory. "Captain Rodriguez, we've been analyzing the flight data from your mission, and we'd like to work with you to develop formal procedures for emergency landings on flooded runways. Your techniques could be applicable to civilian search and rescue operations as well as military missions." The prospect of contributing to aviation safety and rescue capabilities was appealing to Maria. She had always believed that the military's primary mission was to protect and serve others, and developing techniques that could save lives in emergency situations aligned perfectly with that philosophy. 6 months later, the Rodriguez technique was officially incorporated into Air Force emergency procedures manuals. Pilots around the world began training in the unconventional landing methods that Maria had developed under extreme pressure in the mountains of Afghanistan. The technique would eventually be credited with saving dozens of lives in various emergency situations. But, for Maria, the most meaningful recognition came in a simple letter from Morrison's 8-year-old daughter, written in crayon on elementary school paper. "Dear Captain Maria, thank you for bringing my daddy home. He told me you are a hero. I want to be a pilot like you when I grow up." The letter reminded Maria that behind every military mission were real families and real lives. The technical aspects of her achievement, the aerodynamics, the procedures, the awards, were less important than the simple fact that 8 warriors had returned home to their loved ones. As Maria continued her military career, flying missions around the world, she never forgot the lesson learned that day in the Afghan mountains. Sometimes the impossible becomes possible when the stakes are high enough and people are willing to risk everything for each other. It was a lesson that would guide her through the rest of her service and beyond. The flooded runway rescue became legendary within military aviation circles, told and retold in pilot-ready rooms and training classrooms. But for the 9 people who were there that day, 8 SEALs and 1 Air Force captain, it was more than a story. It was a reminder that courage, skill, and determination could overcome even the most impossible odds when lives were on the line. Years later, when Maria retired from active duty, she would look back on that mission as the defining moment of her career. Not because of the recognition or the technical achievement, but because it represented everything she believed about military service, the willingness to risk everything to bring fellow warriors home safely. The C-130 Hercules that had carried them through that impossible mission was eventually retired and put on display at the National Museum of the United States Air Force. A plaque beside the aircraft tells the story of the flooded runway rescue, ensuring that future generations will remember the day when the impossible became possible in the mountains of Afghanistan. And somewhere in Virginia, a young woman who once wrote a letter in crayon is now a pilot herself, inspired by the story of a captain who proved that heroes come in many forms, and that sometimes the greatest heroism is simply refusing to give up when others are counting on you.